Obligatory Christmas episode. Time to take a look at the nice fat man who breaks into your house once a year. So Santa Claus is probably the most obvious candidate for a loose cannon ever. But before we get into the shitmillion versions of Santa Claus out there, or at least a small sampling of them, let's go through some history. Santa and his periphery spring from a marriage of Christian and pagan traditions from throughout Northern Europe, coming together in the United States and forming a sort of folklore melange who's a lot more nice, non-threatening, and marketable than his European forebears. Saint Nicholas hails from the Netherlands, and his legend descends from the historical Saint Nicholas, eventually morphing into the stern but just horse-riding fellow who gives presents to children in early December every year and who maintains in his employ 6 to 8 black men. The Germans had a gift-bringer character promulgated by Martin Luther after the Reformation called Christchild or Christkindl. This was originally intended by Luther to be the literal Christchild, but eventually it turned into more of like a generic angel-child figure. Once in the Americas, this was anglicized to Kris Kringle. Santa also descends from the English figure of Father Christmas, who has descended more from pagan traditions than Christian ones and then eventually merged with them. He makes an uncredited cameo in A Christmas Carol as the Ghost of Christmas Present and carries a more bacchanalian sort of jollity compared to the more austere Saint Nicholas. In Dutch, Saint Nicholas is called Sinterklaas, and since New York was a Dutch colony that eventually got colonized by the English, Sinterklaas was anglicized to Santa Claus, forming a new character altogether, one who also goes by Saint Nick, Father Christmas, and Kris Kringle. The modern image of Santa really solidified in the Americas in the 1800s with the publishing of the poem The Night Before Christmas, which also integrated the whole chimney and reindeer thing. By the early 20th century, the idea of Santa that we have today was pretty much set. In fact, one of the first narrative films ever, released in 1898 and called Santa Claus, also features some of the first ever visual effects. But also codified in by the turn of the century was his connection to the idea of childhood, innocence, and purity. While no longer explicitly a religious figure, he still maintained a sort of sanctity to him, and does to this day. In households that celebrate Christmas and still maintain the Santa tradition with the children, which in the United States counts for most of them, realizing that Santa isn't real is almost kind of a rite of passage. So when it comes to pop cultural depictions of Santa Claus in film and television, especially of the more recent varietal, the operative word for most depictions of Santa is transgression. By the time you're old enough to have a grasp on concepts like narrative and character, you've probably also figured out that Santa is not real. And for those of you who haven't, sorry, spoilers. You see the same thing with characters like Mickey Mouse. These things that were pure and simple in childhood no longer apply to adulthood. So there's this weird thrill with making Santa flawed, or surrounding Santa by flawed things. This is why the concept of transgression as it applies to Santa is so appealing in modern media, and notable non-Santas, like Billy Bob Thornton's Bad Santa, are popular enough to at least warrant a sequel, because it's literally challenging the innocence of childhood, and that never gets old. Transgressive elements against Santa Claus are a popular element in television comedy in particular. I never thought it would end this way. Gunned down by Santa Claus. In Futurama, Santa is a murderous robot who comes to terrorize humanity every Christmas Eve, owing to a glitch that makes his criteria for who is naughty way too high. You've been very naughty, Brian Lela. I checked my list. Well, check it twice. I perform over 50 mega checks per second. over 50 packet check. And yes, that is John Goodman. An episode of The Simpsons had Grandpa Simpson being abandoned on an island with Mr. Burns during World War I by Santa. Grandpa vows revenge for this, but turns out that Santa was only human. Why didn't you ever come back to pick me up? I kept putting it off, and then I was just too embarrassed. American Dad incorporates a revenge element. I review then incorporate There's an episode where Stan and Steve accidentally kill Santa Claus, only to have him resurrected and have his entire army out for revenge against the entire Smith family. Meanwhile, in Family Guy, Santa is more of an overburdened union leader who is ready to throw in the towel on this whole hyper-consumerist Christmas thing. But now instead, all we feeling is dread, because Christmas time is killing us. Now, of course, not all modern Santas take the transgressive approach that challenges the innocence and purity of a character like Santa. Some are pretty straightforward, but the concept of transgression as it applies to Santa is a popular one, especially as it tends to end up back in pretty conventional place of maintaining the status quo. Guy learns the value of family and Christmas. Cynical child learns to believe in Santa, kidnapped Santa gets unkidnapped, and so on. Even the Future May episode does this. Although, granted, the status quo that they return to is the horrible dystopian one. Don't you see? Fear has brought us together. That's the magic of Xmas. The most straightforward adaptations in regular circulation in the United States are the Rankin and Bass stop-motion classics from the 60s and 70s, which still air on network television every year, and I think once a year is just long enough for people to forget how boring these air. I am sorry they air. Now, there were a ton of these varying in quality, but ultimately pretty samey in terms of portrayal, so I am not gonna go through all of them. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is easily the best and most memorable of this group, plus it has far and away the best music, as well as some of the most iconic characters. This is the one that gave us Yukon, Cornelius and the Bumble, which I'm sure you've seen in your local Spencer's Gifts. Being about Rudolph, Santa, barely in this one, aside from doing what the song said he would. Rudolph, with your nose so bright, won't you guide me sleigh tonight? Miracle on 34th Street is comfortably regarded as a classic. I Am Santa Claus. Oh, we don't believe that, do you? Mom. A guy claiming to be Santa gets hired at the Macy's in Herald Square because he's just so good at being Santa. And he's kind of method. And everyone's like, well, it's fine. He's harmless. Until this happens. Oh, damn. Father aggravated assault Ness. Then it turns into a courtroom drama, wherein ultimately the defense has to prove that the guy who lives in a nursing home and calls himself Kris Kringle is, in fact, the real Santa Claus. Also, Maureen O'Hara needs to learn to love again, and cynical child needs to be cynical and learn the magic of childhood. The way they eventually get around this is that the U.S. Postal Service delivers letters addressed to Santa to this guy, meaning that the U.S. Postal Service and by extension the U.S. federal government recognize him as Santa, so there you go. Case literally dismissed. Since the United States government declares this man to be Santa Claus, this court will not dispute it. Case dismissed. Miracle on 34th Street was remade 4 times and was also adapted into a Broadway musical. Thomas Mitchell played him in 1955, Edwin played him in 1959, Sebastian Cabot played him in 1973, and Sir Richard Attenborough played him in 1994. The 1994 remake, starring Richard Attenborough, takes a more Russell Steepa existential approach, with the judge ultimately ruling that he can't, with the prove Christ's to Santa because he can't prove a negative, and the U.S. government currency supports the existence of God, which also cannot be proven, and it seems like a touch of the old false equivalency. If the government of the United States can issue its currency bearing a declaration of trust in God without demanding physical evidence of the existence or the non-existence of a greater being, can it be or then can I said it is this that this is I mean, children don't pledge allegiance to one nation under Santa. But okay. Here the incident that gets Chris in trouble is a lot more pronounced and arguably justified. Rather than whapping a guy on the head during an argument about psychiatry, this guy who is a plant kind of insinuates that Chris might be a pedophile. You got a thing for the little wounds. Ho, ho, ho. 'Cause he ain't much good for nothing else. Who? Dang, I might give him an umbrella to the head, too. Anyway, the 47 version is a classic and better by most metrics, and actually uses the word Missy. Best as 7ers asked the babe I asked Macy's, sending people to tell the story. But for me money, I prefer Attenborough's warmth and vulnerability. Plus the fact that he doesn't pull shit like this. Oh, my outfit. What is it, Mr. Bruce? The 1960s saw a surprising number of terrible movies starring Santa. The transgressive element here isn't so much Santa adopting new character traits, he's still a pretty nice guy with a pretty consistent personality, but rather taking on decidedly non-Santa-like roles. Oh, Mr. Santa, I was reuniting everybody to form an army and fight the Agre. So many questions. The most well-known of these terrible 60s Santa movies is probably Santa Claus Conquers the Martian, by virtue of having been popularized by a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode some 30 years later. Nixon and Vixen and Nixon. Oh yes, and what's in the pipes? Oh, Santa doesn't so much conquer the Martians as get kidnapped by them and eventually negotiate for his and his fellow kidnappees' release. He always has a pretty good sense of humor about the whole thing. Though, I wish you and yours the very best of everything. On Mars, Children aren't allowed to be children, see. And this also has the whole bring back the innocence of childhood and let children be children thing. Basically, there was this entire subgenre of Santa movies that were genre mashups, basically extremely low-rent versions of what we see later with Rise of the Guardians. Very nice. Keep up good work. Russian Alec Baldwin Santa must have spent some time as a roadie going on those tattoos. In this movie, Santa, basically a de facto leader of what appear to be a superhero group of childhood characters. Because now you are a guardian, Santa is the muscle and the expositor. The real protagonist here is sexy Jack Frost. Ivy heard a lot about you. And your teeth. Also, why is the tooth fairy a hummingbird? Hummingbirds don't have teeth. Trick or treat. As with Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, we see Santa getting kidnapped again in The Nightmare Before Christmas. Santa Claus, or, as he is known here, Sandy Claus, gets kidnapped by a well-meaning idiot who uses his position of authority to impose his midlife crisis, willing or no, onto the denizens of both his polity and of a sovereign foreign nation. Surprised, aren't you? I knew you would be. Jack Skellington, cultural of King Imperialist. It fails miserably, of course. My favorite part of the movie is where he tries to rationalize his profound up and the ruination of other people's lives is like a personal growth moment. And at least I left some stories they can tell. I did. Actually, if you think about it, the real winner is ye. At least Santa doesn't put up with his shit. Bumpy sleigh ride, Jack. You suck, Jack. You re too good for him. Sally. Go get your associate's degree or something. Move out of this town. You can do better. Santa believes in you. She's the only one who makes any sense around this insane asylum. In Ernest Saves Christmas, Santa is more like a title than a guy, and the torch gets handed down every so often. I took over the position of Santa Claus in 1889 from a German chap, and this year he needs a replacement from the greater Orlando metropolitan area. No, Santa's replacement is Ernest, but this guy, who likes kids and does local public television for the love of the game. Who are the It does the super 80s thing of look at how businessy and funny and corporate we care, contrasted with the goodness and purity of Santa Claus. The sanctity of Christmas is being befouled by corporate Hollywood funnies. In particular, a horror movie called Santa's Sleigh. 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 It's not sleigh. Sleigh. Sul 80. So, funny you should mention that. Funny you should Santa. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. A horror comedy from 2005 and also one of the worst things to ever happen in human history. Bitch. Get out of the way. Santa absorbs some of the Krampus mythology in this one and features as a demon punishing bad, fake, Funny people instead of being a patriot saint to children. Funny people in sympathy, they appeal, they I know he slaughters the morally bankrupt, and we resupposed to laugh. I guess, because strippers dying in mass is hilare. He even slaughters a Jew with his own menorah because he's equal opportunity horrible. What bottom feeder would think stretching this tired, unclever idea of evil Santa into feature lengthwise a oh, oh, okay, that explains a lot. Thank you. Well, oh, something something transgression. I now have a new worst thing ever of a I've had to watch for Loose Canon. You welcome. I am in big trouble. Mom, we see the Santa as a job motive again in the Santa Claus movies, which are probably on the higher end of quality as far as 90s Christmas entertainment is concerned, and also on the higher end of product placement. Denny's. It's always open. Once again, Santa's kind of like being the Pope, but instead of being inherited or voted upon, it's kind of like the Chronicles of Riddick. In our faith, you keep what you kill. Well, Tim Allen inherits the position of Santavia involuntary manslaughter, and also fine print because lol 90s. Slay there were waives any and all rights to any previous identity, real or implied, and fully accepts the duties and responsibilities of Santa Claus. Also something something broken home and reconnecting with me son because 90s. This movie had 2 sequels. Matrimony, I Gotta Get Married. One where even more fine print forces Tim Claus into an arranged marriage, and another where Martin Short is the lovable antagonist. The former is pretty forgivable, the latter is pretty agonizing, but at least it's a Short. Santa, one of 3 father figures in 2003 self, the other 2 being Will Ferrell's adoptive elf father Bob Newhart, and the other his biological father, James Cain. Santa is played by Ed Asner, which is pretty perfect, but me big takeaway from Santa in which movie is which of the shit million raised Pizze in New York City is in fact the original. There were like 30 raised pizzas. They all claim to be the original, but the real one's on 11th. I actually cross-referenced this a long time ago, and I can't tell the difference between the original raised and the other ones. Sorry. New York pizza's actually really overrated. In Fred Claus, instead of the Santa character being the transgressive element, it comes in the form of his underachieving brother, Fred, played by Vince Vaughn. Santa, played by Paul Giamatti, is genuinely kind, and Fred is overcompensating and resentful. And I have to say, I am honestly kind of shocked at how well Paul Giamatti as Santa works. Really nice, if for once things were nice and calm. Did not see that one coming. Well, Fred resents the shit out of his younger brother, Nicholas, who eventually grew up to become Santa. Now, it's a little-known rule of sainthood, but when you become a saint, you freeze in time, eternally ageless. The rule applies to the family of the saint and spouses as well. Oh, well, that is an interesting way to hand-wave that away. Well, in an effort to reconnect, Fred brings the party to the North Pole. Son, baby, that's me philosophy. You sound angry. Hot music. Oh, Fred, you so crazy. In Robert Zemeckis, weird, uncanny valley-ish monstrosity based on the classic picture book of the same name, the Polar Express is all about the magic of belief and the innocence of childhood. Oh God, oh God! No, why? So, the whole thing is about a magical trip to the North Pole on a magical train. So we don't see Santa, voiced by Tom Hanks, until the very end when they get there. Found this on the seat of me sleigh. Better fix that hole in your pocket. Tom Hanks, Santa Claus kind of sounds like Eddie Murphy doing an impression of a white guy. What a silly Negro. Being able to hear this bell is like a metaphor for the innocence of childhood and, by extension, belief in Santa himself. Like the original book, it has this sort of bittersweet ending where the guy grows up and his friends can't hear the bell anymore, and it's kind of a bit of a bummer, but he can still hear it because he is a true believer, which lends a sort of religiosity to it that you don't see in most Santa-related things. Though I've grown old, the bell still rings for me, as it does for all who truly believe. Believe in the Lord, Santa, and you will be saved. Whether or not this sort of thing appeals to you is probably rooted in how much reverence you have for the idea of the innocence of childhood, which, for is not at all terribly. But that is a big thing, in American culture especially. The sanctity of the innocence of childhood, and how sad it is when we all have to lose it, and that innocence of childhood is better than the cynicism of adulthood, which is why so many of these have to do with shedding adulty trappings and returning to the childy goodness of nature and purity. But the best way to enjoy Santa Claus is to probably take a page from the way children do. Just don't think about it too much.